Hi, everyone. My name is James Dunlea. I am a rising fifth-year doctoral student in the Department of Psychology at Columbia. So thank you again so much to Meltem and Jim for having this really interesting series. I loved hearing the other people's talks, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about my own work as well. Okay, so many scholars who have been studying at the intersection of law and psychology have argued that a single act of punishment can attempt to accomplish many different simultaneous ends. So for example, some people have argued that punishment can seek to deter transgressors from committing future harms. Punishment can seek to restore individuals who have been harmed in some way. And finally, punishment can seek to, for example, rehabilitate transgressors so that they're in some way better now than they were in the past. And of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. These are just some examples that I pulled out from prior literature. So like you just saw on the previous page, many scholars generally agree with the idea that punishment can attempt to accomplish several different instrumental ends. However, some other scholars have argued that punishment has more than just mere instrumental value. And specifically, this group of scholars who are typically kind of at the intersection of law and philosophy have argued that punishment actually carries communicative weight, or that punishment itself is actually expressive. And so in other words, these scholars posit that punishment kind of has this dual character, that punishment is both a behavior that is very concrete and it can accomplish these instrumental ends, but it's also abstract and it can also kind of serve as this tool or mechanism for social messaging. And so, although prior scholars have argued that punishment carries communicative weight, surprisingly few programs of research have actually empirically tested how lay people out in the real world are actually thinking about what punishment is signaling. And so it might be a biased assessment, but I think that neglect of punishment signal is not a small oversight. So many theories of punishment, ranging from deterrence to restorative justice, will rely on the assumption that lay people will understand punishment in a way that is consistent with normative theory. And so I think that if this assumption is mistaken, it could undermine the strength and legitimacy of punishment policy. And so for these reasons, I think it's really important that we first start thinking about how lay people are actually interpreting punishment signals in the first place. And so, again, given what I just said, maybe it's not so big of a surprise that the main focus of the current work that I'll be talking about today is how people are interpreting punishment signal. But there's a little bit of a twist that I should probably mention. So most of the studies I'll be talking about today, I'll be addressing this question through the lens of developmental psychology. And so I'll be really comparing how children versus adults might be thinking about punishment signal. And so I'm a developmental psychologist, and so I think this question is inherently fascinating, but I think that this also has broader implications for psychology as a whole. And so I think it's important to be looking at this question through the lens of developmental psychology, because we can really begin to understand when humans kind of view punishment, again, as having this dual character, as something that is really concrete as a behavior, but also in a bit more abstract way as well. So as having this expressive or communicative function. And so really, I think this could offer some insight into the development of abstract thought within this moral or punitive domain. Okay, so in the first study that I'll be talking about, we began to tap into this broader topic by investigating what types of inferences people might be making about why individuals receive punishments. And so another way of conceptualizing this question is, what are people learning or inferring about somebody's past after learning that such individuals were punished? So again, just to rephrase again, so what do people actually think punishment is telling us or signaling about an individual's past? And so before actually getting into the meat of this study, I thought it would be helpful to perhaps go through some predictions we had before we really collected these data. So again, I'll be laying out some developmental predictions because I'm really interested in, again, the development of these thoughts. So we thought that on one hand, that children might be more likely than adults to tell us that, hey, maybe punishment is telling us something about a person's internal characteristics, such as their bad moral character or their bad essences, if you will. So this possibility is grounded in prior literature on psychological essentialism, which is the idea that people's characteristics, again, like their moral character, arise from internal immutable essences. And so we know from the literature on psychological essentialism that children typically reports more essentialist perspectives than do adults. And so given that children are especially likely to navigate the world through this essentialist lens, they might be more likely to understand or interpret punishment messages as telling them something about people's internal characteristics or their internal essences. On the other hand, we reasoned that maybe adults would be more likely than children to really think that punishment is signaling something about a person's bad behaviors. And again, this is in opposition to people's internal characteristics. So this possibility is grounded in prior literature suggesting that adults conflate prescriptive norms with descriptive norms. So that's basically just a fancy way of saying that adults think that what should occur does occur. And so in the context of the United States, which is the context of all this work, it's a fundamental tenet of criminal law that we don't judge criminality of a person based upon their perceived character, but instead we judge criminality based upon the badness of a person's actions. And so because of the perhaps adults' familiarity with this legal standard, they might be especially likely to infer that people do receive punishment for their behaviors and not so much their internal characteristics. And so again, these were kind of two complementary hypotheses we had for this work in study one. Okay, so in this first study, we tested both children and adults in the same experimental paradigm and compared their responses to one another. Specifically, we focused on testing children who were between the ages of 6 and 8 years old, because prior work suggests that essentialist reasoning is particularly high in this developmental period. Okay, so to actually test the possibilities that I listed on the previous page, we asked participants the simple open-ended question, what is prison? And so the purpose of this question was to really examine how people might spontaneously explain why others might receive this specific form of legal punishments. And so we thought participants' responses to this question could really help us understand what types of inferences people are making about why an individual is punished, or in other words, what punishment could be signaling about that person's past. Okay, so just to quickly orient everyone to this graph, on the y-axis, we have the proportion of participants mentioning each of the categories of interest, so internal and behavioral factors. And on the x-axis, I have the two different age groups that I am comparing. So what did we find? So in line with the idea that children are especially essentialist in how they are navigating the social world, children were more likely than adults to attribute punishment to people's internal characteristics, such as their bad moral character or their bad moral essences. And so we're interpreting this finding to suggest that children are especially likely to understand punishment as signaling something about a person's prior immoral character. So here also, adults were more likely than children to attribute punishment to people's bad behaviors, such as lawbreaking. And so here again, we're interpreting this finding to suggest that adults are especially likely to understand punishment as signaling something about a person's prior immoral behaviors, again, in opposition to their internal characteristics. And so it seems like people here are differentiating between behaviors and internal characteristics. And I'm happy to show you these data during the Q&A if you're interested, but we also did find a very similar pattern of results with closed-ended items. And we also did replicate these data using a different sample of children, specifically children whose parents are incarcerated as well. And so happy to talk about those data if you would like. Okay, so to recap, one main finding from study one was that children are especially likely to understand punishment as communicating information about a person's prior immoral character. So in study two, we built upon this work by investigating children's and adults' inferences about what punishment might signal about who a person will be in the future. And so we're drawing this kind of discrepancy between past and future across these two studies. Okay, so once again, we tested both children and adults in the same paradigm to get this nice developmental perspective. And here we told participants about nice and separately mean characters. So if you're a 6-year-old, that is code for morally good and morally bad. And we told them that these individuals either broke the law and were subsequently punished by going to jail, or we told participants about control characters who instead went on a business trip. So after learning about these characters, participants then indicated how nice or morally good characters would be at 2 different time points. So during and after going to jail or on the business trip. So again, we have 2 time points here. And we probed these moral character judgments by asking questions such as this. So how much do you agree that right now, this person is a good person deep, deep down inside? And so again, this is one of the items that we are kind of tapping into a good true self idea, but again, using words for children. And so the main dependent variable that I will be reporting on here is the perceived change. And so I'll be reporting again on a change score on these next pages. Okay, so here on the y-axis, I have average perceived change in moral goodness. Because I'm using a change score, positive scores are indicating perceived increases in moral goodness, negative scores are indicating perceived decreases in moral goodness, and 0 indicates no perceived change in moral character. So what did we find? So when we asked children to reason about nice individuals, children told us that people are retaining their positive moral characteristics if they've been punished, if they went to jail, and in the control condition. And so for children, it seems like people's positive moral characteristics are pretty stable over time. But adults had a more pessimistic view. And so here adults told us that actually when people are punished, they lose their positive moral characteristics. And they're not saying any changes are happening in the control condition. And so here we're interpreting this finding as suggesting that maybe adults view punishment as a signal of moral degradation. Okay, now we can look at people's responses to the mean individuals. So here kids are being pretty optimistic. So here kids are telling us that people become nicer as a function of punishment, and we find stronger increases in the punishment as opposed to the control business trip condition. So here we're interpreting this finding as suggesting that children are saying that punishment is a signal of moral change or perhaps moral redemption. And once again, adults are being a bit more pessimistic. So adults are telling us that actually people kind of retain their negative moral qualities regardless of punishment or going on a business trip. So pretty much no change for the adults here. And so pretty stark developmental differences there. So in the last slide I'll be talking about, I will be addressing kind of a limitation of study 2. So based upon the results of our second study, it remains unclear whether children only view severe punishments, such as incarceration, as a signal of positive moral change, or whether this effect might generalize to other types of punishments that are perhaps less severe. And so in this study, I'll be telling you about, we investigated whether the main pattern of results from study 2 would generalize across different types of punishments. Okay, so overall, study 3 is very similar to study 2, so I'll gloss over some of the procedure because it's similar. So once again, we told participants about nice and separately mean individuals, but here we told them about only individuals who had transgressed in some way. And so we specified to the participants that the people who they learned about, they did the exact same thing. They both broke the law regardless of if they were nice or mean. And we told them that despite the fact that they committed the same transgressions, that they were actually punished in different ways. So one individual was punished by going to jail, but the other individual was punished by going to timeouts. And so again, we're manipulating the severity of punishment here. Once again, after learning about each individual and how they were punished, participants rated the goodness and badness, or the goodness of each individual at 2 different time points. So before the individual was punished and then after the punishment was finished. And once again, I'll be reporting on the perceived change. Okay, so just as a sanity check, we wanted to make sure that children did understand that incarceration is more severe than timeout, and they did understand that. They very much agreed that incarceration is more severe than timeout, so we did pass our manipulation check. So here, when reasoning about nice individuals, we find a similar pattern of results as the last study. So children are telling us that people are retaining their positive moral qualities regardless of the severity of punishments. And here, this is my favorite result of this study. So here it seems that really, regardless of the severity of punishment, children are telling us that, hey, people are redeemed, regardless if you're going to timeout or you're going to jail, you're becoming a better person. And so it seems that for children, it seems that punishment itself, regardless of the severity, is a signal of moral redemption. Okay, so I will go quickly through my conclusions so we can wrap up. So in study one, we found that both children and adults view punishment as communicating some sort of information about individuals' past, but it seems that people are drawing different inferences. So whereas children are interpreting punishment as signaling something bad about somebody's internal characteristics in the past, adults are saying that, yeah, it's something bad about an individual's past, but it's more about an individual's behaviors as opposed to their internal characteristics. So in the rest of the studies, we found that despite, telling us that, punishment is saying something about an individual's bad past, children are saying that, hey, punishment is also communicating that you might be a better person in the future. So children, but not adults, are telling us that punishment is a signal of moral redemption. And in study three, it seems that punishment doesn't need to be severe in order for children to interpret it as being redemptive. So with that, I would like to quickly close. Thank you, my collaborators, for helping on this research. So Larissa Heifetz, my advisor, and Red Woolley, our research assistants, our funding sources, my lab mates, and thank you for the partners and children who participated in this research. Thank you.